$2 and change. That was the entire contents of Mei Lin Chow's coin purse the afternoon she climbed down from the supply wagon into the dust of Silver Creek, Nevada, in the summer of 1876. She hadn't planned on this town. She'd planned on somewhere dry, somewhere with a name that didn't make shopkeepers fall silent when she gave hers. But her husband was 7 weeks in his grave outside Carson City, crushed when a grading crew set a charge too close to the tracks, and the foreman who signed his final pay had informed her, gently enough. He probably thought that a widow's claim on a dead man's wages was something for the company men in Sacramento to sort out. She didn't have fare to Sacramento. She had fare to Silver Creek and a reference letter from the camp chaplain that she doubted would open a single door. The town was livelier than she'd expected. Wagons crowded the main road, freight haulers arguing over grain prices, a smith's hammer ringing under a livery awning, dust hanging in slow amber clouds beneath every wheel and hoof. Mei Lin walked the boardwalk with her travel bag gripped in both hands, reading the signs over each doorway. General store, land office. A boarding house with a card in the window. Reading no rooms, though the woman behind the glass watched. Her pass with a look that said there'd have been no room for her regardless of what the card claimed. She tried the dry goods store first, since she could stitch a straight seam faster than most women twice her size, and the clerk, Flower, dusted up both sleeves, looking like he badly needed the help, heard her out with his arms folded, then said the position had been filled that very morning. She tried the boarding house next, offering to cook and scrub floors in trade for a bed, and the landlady claimed a full house, though Mei Lin passed that same sign twice more before the week was out. She was standing outside the assay office, wondering if a single business in Silver Creek hadn't already decided her answer before she'd opened her mouth, when a horse came down the street at an easy trot, a big, dark bay gelding with one white sock, ridden by a man who sat the animal like they'd grown from the same spine. He reined up outside the feed store not 10 feet from where she stood and swung down. Tall, weathered by sun, dressed no different from every other rancher she'd passed that week, except he looked at her the way almost nobody else in town had bothered to. Straight on. Like she was a person on a boardwalk and not an obstacle to step around. "Ma'am," he touched his hat brim, "you've got the look of someone who's been asking around and getting nowhere fast. Is it that plain?" She'd assumed 6 refusals hadn't left a mark on her face. Apparently a stranger on horseback could read her easier than she liked. "You're walking like a woman turned away 4 times before noon. I'd guess 5 by now." 6. She'd stopped counting the polite no's and started tallying only the ones bothering to explain themselves. Ezra Callahan. He offered a hand, and after a beat she took it. His grip was careful, like a man accustomed to being stronger than whatever he was shaking. "I run a spread about 4 miles east of town. Callahan Cattle, if anybody's mentioned it." "Nobody's mentioned much of anything to me." He tied his horse to the rail. "Looking for work or looking for a way out of Silver Creek?" "Work. Nowhere else wants me badly enough to buy me a ticket out." He went quiet a moment, studying her the way she imagined he'd study a horse he was weighing whether to buy, which, oddly, she didn't mind, since at least he was actually considering it instead of refusing outright. "I'm not hiring," he said at last. Her chest clenched. 6 refusals hadn't prepared her for a 7th, delivered so plainly by a man who'd seemed for one strange minute like he might be different. "I'm asking," he added, before she could turn. "There's a difference. 400 head, a foreman who can't keep a ledger straight to save his hide, and a bunkhouse full of men who won't touch needle and thread if their shirts fall clean off their backs. I need someone who can read figures, mend a seam, and not flinch at a branding iron. That's not charity work I'm offering. That's a job I can't run the place without, and so far nobody in this town's been fool enough to want it." "Why not?" "Because I pay a widow the same wage I'd pay a man, and Silver Creek doesn't care much for that math." He said it flat, no heat to it, like commenting on the weather. "You interested, or have I wasted both our afternoons?" She thought of the coins in her purse, the boarding house that had twice claimed no vacancy, the 6 shut doors behind this one open hand, and said yes before she'd fully decided to. The ride out to the Callahan spread ate up the better part of an hour. Mei Lin sat the wagon bench beside a hand named Otis Reed while Ezra rode ahead on the bay. By the time the house came into view, low, long, a porch running its full length, she understood 2 things. First, this was no small outfit, whatever Ezra's plain talk suggested. Second, every man in the yard stopped his work to watch her climb down, and none of them looked pleased about it. The foreman met them at the porch steps, thick through the neck, hat pushed back, mouth already moving before Ezra's boots hit the ground. "This the help?" "This is Mrs. Chow. She's straightening out the books you've been butchering since March, and taking over the mending besides. Men won't care for a woman going through the accounts. The men don't have to care for it. I do the hiring here, Wyatt Voss, same as always." Ezra's voice didn't rise, but something in it shut the subject like a door slamming. "Show her the office. Somebody get her trunk off that wagon before Reed decides it's easier left in the yard." Voss didn't push further, though the look he threw Mei Lin on his way past wasn't one she'd soon forget. She'd seen it before, in the eyes of railroad men who'd already decided, long before she spoke, exactly what a Chinese woman traveling alone was worth to them. It had never once meant anything good. The office was a cramped room off the main house, ledgers stacked crooked on a shelf that hadn't been dusted since well before her husband died, let alone since March. Dust hung thick in the light of a single window, and somewhere past the corral a dog barked twice and gave up. She sat at the desk that first evening with a small lamp and worked through 6 months of Voss's arithmetic. The day's heat hadn't broken by sundown. She worked with sleeves pinned back and a cloth at her wrist to keep sweat off the ink, moths drawing slow, stubborn circles against the lamp glass. Column after column, feed, tack, wages, the small cash outlays that kept a working ranch fed and shod. None of it added up the way 6 years of her husband's own bookkeeping had taught her honest numbers should. Careless mistakes scatter thin like buckshot. These errors had a shape. They leaned one direction only, fattening the same set of entries every time. A woman who'd spent 6 years balancing a railroad worker's pay against his debts knew the difference between a clumsy hand and a guided one. By the time the lamp burned low, she'd found enough irregularities, some careless, some not careless at all, to fill 4 pages of her own careful notes. She brought them to Ezra the next morning at the corral fence, where he watched 2 hands working a colt that didn't much want working. He read her notes in silence, jaw tightening with every line. By the 3rd page, he'd gone still enough that the colt tossed its head as if it felt the change in him before she did. These 3 entries. He tapped the page. Feed purchases. Same supplier, same month, double the going rate. I checked the supplier's prices against 2 other ranches' accounts posted at the feed store. Someone's either buying feed badly or buying it fine and pocketing the difference. Voss handles all the feed contracts. He said it slowly, like a man working out the shape of something he hadn't wanted to see clearly for years. "I'm not accusing anybody. I'm only telling you what the figures say. The figures say plenty." He folded the pages into his coat. "Keep this between us. Keep doing exactly what you're doing." The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings with the ledgers, afternoons mending shirts and harness leather in the shade of the bunkhouse porch, where the hands mostly ignored her, which she'd learned to prefer over the alternative. Ezra checked her work most evenings, hat in hand in the office doorway, asking sharp questions most men in Silver Creek wouldn't have credited a woman with answering, and actually listening to her answers as if they mattered. On the 6th day, a steer broke loose from the branding pen and came through the yard at a dead run, panicked and heavy enough to snap a leg or worse on anyone caught in its path. Mei Lin was crossing from the spring house, arms full of linens, when she heard the shouting and turned to find 800 pounds of animal bearing down with no time left to clear it. She did the only thing she could think of, flung the linens wide and shouted, a sudden white burst of cloth that spooked the steer sideways, just enough to send it thundering past her shoulder instead of through it, close enough she felt the heat off its flank. Ezra reached her at a dead run, breathing hard, hands checking her over before he seemed to remember himself and stopped. "You didn't move." There wasn't time to move, only time to think of something faster than running. Her heart still slammed against her ribs. It worked. That's what matters. It worked because you didn't panic. He said it like the observation cost him something. Most people freeze solid in front of a stampede. You turned it aside instead. I've had practice standing still while large, dangerous things bear down on me and deciding what to do about it. She'd meant it lightly, but it landed heavier than intended. He didn't ask which large, dangerous things she meant. He only nodded, as though he understood well enough without her saying it plain, and helped her gather the trampled linens from the dirt. It was the 9th day the trouble Voss had promised in that first look finally arrived. She was walking back from the spring house, water bucket in hand, when 3 hands blocked her path, not by accident. The oldest of them, a rangy man named Silas Ward who worked closest under Voss, spat into the dirt near her boots. "Here you've been going through? The book's looking for men to blame. I go through. The book's because Mr. Callahan asked me to. My daddy fought. Chinaman on the railroad crews 4 years running. Said your kind'll smile in a man's face and cheat him blind the second his back's turned. I haven't cheated anyone." She kept her voice level, though her grip on the bucket handle had gone white-knuckled, the water trembling with the effort of holding still. "I've found where the cheating already was." Silas stepped closer. Close enough she caught whiskey on him, though it wasn't yet noon, and for one long moment she thought he meant to knock the bucket from her hands, or worse, with nobody in the yard to witness it. That was when hooves came fast around the barn corner, the bay cutting between Mei Lin and the 3 men so tight Silas had to jump clear or be run down. Ezra was off the horse before it fully stopped, and whatever sat on his face sent all 3 hands scrambling for something urgent to do elsewhere. Silas. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting. "You've got something to say to me. Say it to my face instead of cornering a woman by the spring house when you figure nobody's watching." Wasn't cornering nobody. I've been writing this section 15 minutes. Saw exactly what it was. Ezra's hand hadn't moved toward the pistol at his hip, but Silas's eyes kept flicking to it anyway. You want to work for a man who pays fair wages and asks fair questions, you keep your hands and your mouth to yourself around anyone on this payroll. That includes Mrs. Chow. Don't care for the arrangement. Voss can settle your account today and you can find work somewhere your daddy's opinions suit better. Silas backed off muttering, and the yard emptied fast. Ezra turned to her, and for the first time since the boardwalk, something in his face wasn't entirely steady. "You're not hurt." "No." Her hands shook regardless, though she willed them still. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Shouldn't have happened at all. On my land, under my nose." He took the bucket from her, an unnecessary gesture she let him make anyway. Voss put him up to it. "I'd stake the whole herd on it." They walked back toward the house together, slower than the errand required, the evening cooling the way it did once the sun dropped behind the ridge. Cicadas ground away steadily in the grass, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone worked a harmonica through the same 4 bars of a tune neither recognized. "You could send me back to town," she said. Once the silence had stretched long enough, she felt obliged to fill it. "It'd be simpler for you. No trouble with Voss or Silas or anyone else who minds the arithmetic." "I could." He didn't slow his stride to consider it, which told her more than a long pause would have. "I could also let a man skim my ranch blind because running him off would ruffle a few feathers. And I've never run this place taking the easy road when the honest one sat right in front of me." He glanced sideways. "You want to go back to town? I'll drive you myself and settle your wages fair for the days worked. But don't mistake me sending you back for you being the problem here. The problem's wearing a foreman's hat, and I mean to deal with him proper in my own time. I don't want to go back to town." The words came out plainer than intended, and she didn't take them back. "There's nothing in Silver Creek for me but shut doors." "Then you'll stay," he said, with the same flatness he'd used the day he told her he wasn't hiring, telling her the matter was settled as far as he was. "Concerned. You can't prove any of this. From a spilled bucket and a drunk man's mouth. No." He looked toward the barn, where Voss's shadow had vanished a minute before Silas blocked her path, timing that seemed less like coincidence the longer she turned it over. "But I can prove it from a ledger given time, and you're the one finding the proof." It was 2 evenings later she learned the rest of it, in the quiet after the bunkhouse lamps went dark and before her own candle burned out. She'd stayed late at the desk chasing one last discrepancy through 8 months of feed receipts when Ezra came to the doorway, hat in hand, in a way that told her the visit wasn't about the ranch at all. "You asked once why I hired a widow nobody else in town would touch." He leaned against the frame. "Never gave you the honest answer." "You said you needed someone who could read a ledger." "True enough. Not the whole truth, though." He turned his hat over once. "My wife died 4 years back. Fever, the kind that moves through a house in a week and leaves nothing behind to fight. Whole town came to the funeral, told me how sorry they were. Then every one of them started treating me like a man who needed managing instead of a man who needed work to do. Nobody offered me a job. Didn't have to. But I know what it looks like when a whole town's decided it already knows everything about you before you've said a word. That's not the same as what happened to me on the boardwalk. No, yours is worse. And I know it. I'm not fool enough to think a dead wife and a dead husband and a foreign face carry the same weight in this town's eyes. But I recognize something in the way you were standing outside that assay office, like someone who's had every door shut in her face and is still deciding whether to knock on one more. He met her eyes. I wanted to be the one door that didn't shut. She had no answer for that. She trusted her voice to carry steady. So she said nothing at first. Instead, she opened the desk drawer and drew out the one thing she'd carried the whole way from Carson City that wasn't strictly useful. A folded square of paper gone soft at its creases from months of handling. My husband's last letter to the company office, asking after his back pay before the accident. He never sent it. I found it in his coat after. She smoothed the fold flat with 2 fingers. I've read it more times than I can count, looking for something in it to carry forward. And all I ever find is a man asking politely for money already earned, from people who never meant to give it whether he lived or died. I kept it because it's the last thing he wrote in his own hand, not for any wisdom in it. It only holds him. Ezra looked at the letter but didn't touch it, which she understood as its own kind of respect. I don't have anything of my wife's left in a drawer. Burned most of her things after the fever. On the doctor's word, it wasn't safe to keep them. Kept 1 hairpin. Silver, nothing special. Sits in a tin on my dresser. Couldn't tell you why that one thing over anything else, except a man needs to keep something. Or the losing of a person starts to feel like it never happened at all. That's exactly it. She folded the letter back along its worn crease. Something to prove it happened. Something to prove they were real. He had no answer for that either, not right away. For a moment, the 2 of them simply sat with the lamp burning low between them, 2 people who'd each buried someone and kept one small, useless, necessary thing to remember them by. He rose after a while, nodded once as though her silence and her letter together had told him something true, and left her to the last of her candle. In the weeks that followed, Mei Lin worked the ledgers harder than she'd worked anything since her husband's own accounts, tracing the phantom supplier's name back, through 8 months of receipts until she found the one. Mistake Voss hadn't thought to cover a signature on a delivery slip matching no hand at the actual feed store in town. She brought the discovery to Ezra in the barn, voice low though nobody was within earshot. The cousin who supposedly runs this supply contract, I asked the feed store's own clerk if he knew the name. Never heard of him. There is no cousin, Ezra. There's only Voss writing himself a second wage under a name that doesn't exist. You're certain. Not a challenge. A man wanting solid ground before stepping onto it. I checked the clerk's own delivery book against the signature on our receipts. They don't match. They were never meant to. Voss invented a man to steal from me in plain sight. He folded the papers into his coat, the same gesture she'd come to recognize as a matter now settled beyond discussion. If we confront him with this and he's desperate enough, he might not go quiet. He won't go quiet regardless. A man who's stolen for 6 years doesn't hand over the proof of it with a smile. We're not doing this quiet or careful anymore. We're doing it in front of the whole town, where he can't talk his way around it with just the sheriff in a back room. Ride into Silver Creek with me tomorrow. Bring the ledgers. She slept poorly that night, turning the coming confrontation over the way she'd once turned over her husband's unsent letter, hunting for the version of tomorrow that ended without anyone hurt and not quite finding it. The feed contract came apart 3 weeks later, loudly. Ezra rode into Silver Creek with 6 full months of records Mei Lin had assembled, page after page cross-checked against the feed store's own posted prices, proving Wyatt Voss had billed Callahan cattle for grain at nearly double market rate and pocketed the difference through a cousin who existed only on paper. He laid it all out for the sheriff in the middle of the general store, half the town listening, and Voss, cornered with nowhere left to talk his way to, did the one thing that made everything worse before it got better. He grabbed a rifle off the rack by the counter. Mei Lin had come into town that same afternoon on a ranch errand, standing near the door when Voss swung the rifle up, wild-eyed, shouting that no woman's arithmetic was going to cost him 6 years of skimming a fair man's ranch. Ezra moved without a word, putting himself between the rifle and the room, and for one endless second, Maylin thought she was about to watch a second husband die in front of her over dollars and pride. It wasn't Ezra who ended it. It was Maylin herself stepping forward before she had time to be afraid of it, snatching a heavy bolt of canvas off the dry goods shelf and swinging it hard into the back of Voss's knees, buckling him to the floor before the rifle could level. The sheriff had the weapon out of his hands and irons on his wrists inside 10 seconds, and the whole store went quiet enough to hear the dust settle. Ezra looked at her across the wreckage of scattered flour sacks and fallen canvas, and something in his face wasn't gratitude alone. It was closer to seeing her clearly for the first time, though he'd claimed weeks earlier to have seen her clearly from the start. Where in the world did you learn to swing a bolt of canvas like that? 6 years married to a railroad man. You learn to move fast, or you get left behind at every camp. Her hands shook again, worse than the day at the spring house, but her voice stayed even. I didn't plan that. I only knew I wasn't going to watch it happen to you. Good thing you didn't plan it. Man who plans a rescue usually gets there a beat too late. He helped her step around the fallen sacks. Come on, let's get you home. Home. He said it plainly, without seeming to notice he'd said it at all, and Maylin found she didn't want to correct him. 3 months passed, and Silver Creek changed its mind about a number of things, the way towns do once the story that matters shifts from what a person is to what a person's done. Wyatt Voss sat in the territorial jail awaiting trial for fraud, his invented cousin's supply contract exposed as worthless, and the Callahan Ranch ran its feed accounts at honest prices for the first time in years, every figure balanced by Maylin's own hand. Silas Ward never came back to work. 2 of the other hands who'd blocked her path that day sought her out separately to apologize, stiff and awkward about it, the way men are when made to see plainly something they'd preferred left blurred. She accepted both apologies without making either man grovel for it. There was no profit in that, and she'd never much cared for profit earned at someone else's expense. The bunkhouse mending pile had shrunk to almost nothing, not because the men needed fewer shirts, but because half of them now brought their clothes to her with an easy nod instead of the weary distance of her first weeks, as if the fight in the general store had settled some question in the ranch's collective mind that honest bookkeeping alone never could have. The ranch itself showed the change plainer than any ledger. Honest feed prices meant 2 more horses in the string come autumn, bought outright instead of financed against a fraudulent contract. The general store in Silver Creek extended the Callahan account fair credit again, its owner having decided, once Voss's fraud came to light, that a widow's arithmetic was worth a good deal more to him than whatever his neighbors whispered at the counter. And the letter Maylin had once kept folded in a drawer, as the last trace of a dead man's hand now sat in a small wooden box on the office shelf, beside the settled ledgers, no longer the only thing she had left to prove a life had mattered. She found Ezra at the corral fence one evening in late September, watching the same young horse from her first morning on the ranch, gentled now, taking a saddle without complaint. You did that, she said, nodding at the horse. 3 months of patience. Some things can't be rushed. Push a green horse too hard too early, you get a horse that never trusts a hand again. He didn't look away from the corral, though something shifted in his voice. Same's true of most things worth having, I've found. Is that so? It is. He turned to face her fully, hat off, the low sun gilding the dust in the yard gold. I told you once I wasn't hiring, then told you I was asking. Got another question along those same lines, if you'll let me put it to you plain the way I put the first one. She felt her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. Ask it. I'm not looking for a bookkeeper anymore, Maylin. The books are settled. The ranch is honest. Voss's cousin isn't coming within 100 miles of my feed contracts again. What I'm asking now has nothing to do with any of that. He held her gaze steady. I'm asking if you'd stay on this ranch as my wife, not my hired help. I know what this town will say about it, some of it ugly, and I can't promise you it'll stop saying it soon. But I can promise you a door that never shuts, same as I promised the first day. And I find I want to promise you a good deal more than that besides. She thought of the coins she'd carried into Silver Creek, the 6 refusals before Ezra Callahan rode down the street on his dark bay horse, the ledger pages that had uncovered a thief, the bolt of canvas that had saved a man's life, and found the answer had been settling in her for weeks without her fully admitting it to herself. Yes, she said, steady now, though her heart wasn't. I'll stay. He didn't kiss her in the middle of the corral yard, not with two hands still working the far fence line, but he took her hand in both of his, careful, the way he'd been careful with it that very first day on the boardwalk, and held it like something he didn't intend to let go of again. Behind him, the young horse tossed its head once at the fence rail and settled, and the late light lay long and gold across the yard, over the office where her ledgers sat balanced and honest, over the bunkhouse where men now brought her their mending without a second thought, over a ranch quietly and thoroughly remade by the same steady hands that had once carried $2 and a dead man's letter into a town that wanted no part of her. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stuck with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for watching.